Hello, squad. This is Anne of Green Gables, Abridged. So I was, as some of you may know, I was trying to do 50 Shades of Grey Abridged, and I just couldn't. I just couldn't read this. It was just so terrible. So instead of doing that, I put that aside and I decided to go the other way. Instead of doing the worst book in the world, I would do one of my all-time favorite books, Anne of Green Gables. It's the first in a series, a pretty long series of books about Anne Shirley. And it's been my all-time favorite book as a child. It's a children's book or children/teenagers maybe, but more children's book. And I think it's one of the most important books to me because of its heroine and what she taught me. This Anne Shirley is a character that is very special to me personally, as she is a weirdo, and she taught me that it's okay to be one, essentially. She's the kind of person that her qualities, her traits are things that people frown upon, things that people see as off-putting and strange and sometimes even unnerving. But she's depicted not as any of these things. She's depicted as unique and interesting. And it kind of shows you that you or I will eventually find people who would like us, even though, or maybe because, we're not exactly normal. You just, have to find someone or someone's whose weirdness goes with yours or even complements yours. Hashtag squad life, maybe. I think so. And, it's not the most complicated of messages, but I think the way that it's written and the way that this character is built is pretty special. So, that was me gushing. And I have to tell you something else. As I read these books as a child, I wasn't familiar with this foreign language of yours, so I read them in Hebrew. I read their translation, the original, or of course in English. They're Canadian books, actually. And the novelty here, for me at least, is that I'm gonna read them in English, in the original language, for the first time, which I find pretty exciting, to be able to read those books that I loved and love, the way that they were originally written. So, yeah. So, our first chapter is entitled Mrs. Rachel Lynde is Surprised. Now this is interesting because Mrs. Rachel Lynde is not at all one of the main characters in this book. And yet, the first chapter is entirely from her point of view, which I don't think we get much of later on. And there's a reason for that, I think, which is pretty interesting. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is sort of like the town gossip. This whole story is happening in a town called Avonlea, which is a tiny little town in Canada. And we're not informed of this right away, but we will soon. And she is a town gossip, and Moreover, she's a normie, and she represents the normie point of view. So in this book that begins with and is telling about stuff that aren't exactly normal, well-behaved beginning of the 20th century behavior, we get from the perspective of someone who judges it and looks to find what's wrong with it, which is kind of like judging it. I don't know why I said that. So anyway, Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised, and we will soon find out what surprised her so much. But first, we're gonna get a little description of who she is. And the way that it starts is telling us exactly where she lives. She lived or lives, depends on your perspective, just where the Avonlea Main Road dipped down into a little hollow. And this whole thing, I mean, we get a really long nature description right here, because for Lucy Maud Montgomery, who's the writer of these books, if I haven't mentioned that before, I don't think I have, nature descriptions are like food descriptions for George R. R. Martin. We get a lot of them, some of them very unneeded, very drawn out, but what we need to know about this description is that this little town has a lot of nature in it, but mainly Mrs. Lynde, Mrs. Rachel, they call her Mrs. Rachel, I think mostly, lives in a very specific point in Avonlea, which allows her to know everything that's going on. It's like a strategic point to live in for the town's gossip. And we get mention of a brook, a little maybe river, I think that's what it means, that is very wild all through Avonlea, but by the time it reached the house of Mrs. Lynde, it was all quiet and well-conducted little stream. And what's written here is that for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. So through this description, we learn a lot about Mrs. Rachel, and this is going to be very useful in this chapter. So Mrs. Rachel is sitting at her window usually and keeps a sharp eye on everything and everyone that's passing by her, and everyone needs to pass by her because of her strategic location. And she notices brooks, but she also notices children and adults and you know, creatures of nature that are walking through, and she definitely notices anything odd or out of place. And now we get an interesting tangent, not exactly about Mrs. Lynde, more about people in general through the description of Mrs. Lynde, because it says that there are many people in this world, in Avonlea and out of it, that can attend very closely to their neighbor's business and to other people's business. But what happens when they do is that they neglect their own business. They don't really take care of themselves because they're so busy taking care of other people's business. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those special people who was able to be very much in other people's business, but also take care of her own pretty well. actually really well, because she was one of the town's most notable housewives, which, I don't know, how does one become a notable housewife? Is there like a competition of notability, or like, are people talking about how notable a housewife is in relation to other housewives, and how do people really know what constitute notability housewife-wise? All questions that I've been pondering. But anyway, she's a notable housewife, and she runs the sewing circle, and she helps run the Sunday school, and she has all sorts of business of her own she attends to while attending to other people's business. So she's a pretty talented person. Because while doing all of her chores and all of the things that she manages, she still finds abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window and practically spying on everyone in town. So, page flip. Here we go. This is happening. It's a real book with real pages. We're going old school here, folks. So, yeah, anyone who goes through town, anyone who wants to go out of town has to pass through her window and under her eye. And this is important because something is about to happen. Someone is about to leave town, and this is important to our story. So our story begins one afternoon in early June. And per usual, Mrs. Lynde is sitting at her window, watching, lurking, and it is said that her husband, Thomas, is sowing the turnips. She's like sort of watching him, for lack of better stuff to watch. And we get a little description of this Thomas. And the interesting part of this description is that the Avonlea people called him Rachel Lynde's husband, which is another thing that teaches us about how prominent Mrs. Lynde is. And now, when she watches, we are privy to her thought process. What she's thinking is about Matthew Cuthbert, a new character. Why is she thinking about him? Because she sees him riding down the road and out of Avonlea. Now, Matthew, we're gonna know him. We're gonna know him really well. But for now, we know nothing about him. We just know that Mrs. Lynde is watching him go out of town. And she's baffled. She's baffled by that because for the best of her knowledge, he's supposed to be sowing his turnips too. I have no idea what turnips are, by the way. It's a fun word to say, isn't it? Turnips. So he's supposed to be sowing his turnips. So she knows this because she heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from Matthew. But Matthew, by the way, didn't tell that someone. He was asked, and then he finally told. Because it said here, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. Which teaches us the first thing we need to know about Matthew is that he's quiet or shy, not outgoing, not much of a talker. He's like the exact opposite of Mrs. Lynde. Well, maybe not the exact opposite, but he's like the least useful person to her because he never volunteers information, and she is all about, getting information. So now she sees him, and not only was he supposed to be sowing his turnips, there's no reason she could fathom that he would go out of town, and not just out of town, but in his white collar and best suit of clothes, which for her is plain proof that he's going to do something important out of town. And again, she's completely baffled, because had it been any other man in Avonlea, she could probably put this and this together and reach some valid explanation of why this person is going out of town in his best clothes. But Matthew, he so rarely went out of his house, even that she couldn't even begin to think why, because it's described here he was the shyest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers or to any other place where he might have to talk. So yeah, not a very outgoing kind of person Matthew is. Probably a bit of an introvert. But Mrs. Lynde is wondering, and her afternoon enjoyment is completely spoiled. She's thinking, I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. So yeah, she's really up in other people's business. It's like really a part of her life, a part of her day. She needs to know, and she needs to know now. So she decides to get out of her house and try to figure this shit out. And what she decides to do is to step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why. And who's Marilla? It says that Mrs. Rachel, when she sets out, it says that she sets out to where the Cuthberts lived. So our first thought must be that they are husband and wife, because, we're at the beginning of the 20th century, man and woman living together, having the same last name, probably husband and wife. I mean, it's also probable regardless to the beginning of the 20th century, isn't it? We don't know that now, but as it will turn out, eventually they're not husband and wife, they're brother and sister. And that's interesting as well, because it's not a very usual arrangement for 60-year-old man and woman, brother and sister, to be sharing a home, is it? I mean, first of all, they're supposed to be married at their ripe old age. They're supposed to have kids and grandkids, and these people, these two, Matthew and Marilla, they don't have any of that, and they just kept on living together as they did when they were kids in their parents' house, Green Gables. So just from these hard facts, we get that Matthew and Marilla are not your plain, regular Avonlea residents. They're weirdos. And they have to be weirdos for them to be able to accommodate Anne later. So Mrs. Lynde is making her way to Green Gables, the home of Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, and we get a description of where it is exactly. It's in a very remote location. I mean, as remote as it could be in a very, very small town, as we said before. Matthew's and Marilla's father built it, and he was as shy and as silent as Matthew, so he built his house as far away as he possibly could from everyone else in town, from his fellow men, without actually retreating to the woods. The house was barely visible from the main road, and Mrs. Lynde, when thinking about where the house is, she thinks it's not living. It's not living at all. Because trees aren't much company, in her opinion. She would rather look at people. But she reflects that the Cuthberts seem content enough. But then she supposes that they're used to it. They're used to that kind of living, looking at tree, being remote from other people. And she says, a body can get used to anything, even to being hanged. Because, of course, living far off is just as bad as being hanged. So anyway, she reaches Green Gables finally, and she looks at the yard, which is very pretty. Has a lot of trees, a lot of descriptions of trees here, which I'm going to skip. But an important description is that there is no stray stick or stone to be seen, and Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been any sticks or any kind of dirt. The yard was just as clean as the house. We'll soon enter the house and see how clean it is. So she knocks on the door and she's told to come in. And she comes in, and the first thing she sees is the kitchen. And the kitchen, it says, would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean. And I get that. Sometimes when something is too clean, it can't be all that cheerful. It has like a strict sense to it, and this kitchen probably does. And in the kitchen, Marilla is sitting. She's not sitting in the sunlit part of the kitchen. She's sitting in a darker spot because she's always been slightly distrustful of sunlight, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. So, Marilla, quite a serious person, she takes everything really seriously, from her cleaning to her child upbringing, and sunlight is way too unserious and irresponsible for her. So Marilla is sitting in the kitchen, in a dark corner of the kitchen, and she's knitting when Mrs. Lynde is coming in. And Mrs. Lynde, of course, spots everything that there is to be spotted. The first of which is that the table is laid for supper. And it's not laid out for 2 people, but for 3. So Mrs. Lynde knows that Marilla must be expecting someone. But the dishes are not like the fancy china. They're like everyday dishes, and there's only one kind of cake. So Mrs. Lynde figures that the guests that they're expecting can't be all that important. I mean, you have to have more than one kind of cake for an important guest. That's what we gather from this information. So Mrs. Lynde is very confused. So why did Matthew wear his fancy clothes to bring an unimportant guest for tea? We don't know. Rachel wants to find out. She's practically spinning at this point. So Marilla says good evening and invites her to sit down. And they exchange some pleasantries, and it says that something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Yeah, that's cute. I think it's cute. Although, I don't know how dissimilar they are in their characters, at least from what we got until now. I mean, Mrs. Lynde is probably a little more cheerful, a little more upbeat, maybe, and Marilla is kind of serious and somber. But now we get a physical description of those two that sets them further apart. Marilla is tall and thin, and she has gray streaks in her hair, which is always twisted up in a hard little knot behind her ears, and she's got those hairpins stuck like aggressively hard through her hair. She looks rigid, and she is. Mrs. Lynde is a little chubby and not as rigid looking, but no matter. The interesting bit about Marilla's physical description is that there was a saving something about her mouth, which if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. And yeah, she has a very dry sense of humor. We'll find out, but she's funny. She can be hilarious, Marilla, in a very dry and rigid way. So they exchange pleasantries, and Mrs. Rachel is like, yeah, I'm well, but I was afraid that you're not, because I saw Matthew and I thought he was going to the doctor's, which of course she didn't. She doesn't think that he's on his way to the doctor's, but she asks that to find out where he is going. And Marilla's lips are twitching, understandably. She expected that. She expected Mrs. Rachel to come over and ask. She knew that it would be too much for her curiosity not to come over and ask what's going on. So she's all like, yeah, I'm well. Nothing's up. It's just that Matthew's going to Bright River. It's another place, pretty close to where Avonlea is. So Matthew's going to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. Like, yeah, we're getting a little boy. No big deal. Just adopting a boy. Nothing major. But if Marilla had said that, it's so funny to me, but it says, if Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. Okay. So Mrs. Rachel is stricken dumb. She starts to think that Marilla might be making fun of her, but she knows Marilla too well, and she's not the kind of person to be making those kinds of jokes. So she's like, "What? Are you serious?" And Marilla's like, "Yeah, sure, of course. Like getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia were just part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm, instead of being something that's unheard of in this little tiny town." And Mrs. Rachel is just thinking in exclamation points at this point. She's like, a boy? Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert? Like, of all people, they're adopting a boy from an orphan asylum? Oh my God, oh my lordy, nothing else is ever going to surprise me after this one. Nothing. Her head is practically exploding, really. But she gathers herself somewhat and asks, like, what on earth put such a notion into your head? She's quite disapproving. Obviously, she's Mrs. Lynde. We know her well enough by now to know that she would disapprove. And we are quite, I don't know what we're supposed to be thinking at this point, because Marilla is not taking this whole thing very seriously, or at least the way that she's talking about it, she's not really taking it seriously. And we know that Marilla is a serious person. This is what, like, the first thing we know about her. So what the hell is going on? Maybe she's just doing it for Mrs. Lynde's benefit. Like, she doesn't want to make a big deal out of it because she knows how Mrs. Lynde is going to react, and maybe dissuade her from doing such a weird thing. But she tells Mrs. Lynde that they've been thinking about it for some time, because one of their friends said that she was going to adopt a little girl a few months back, and she and Matthew were talking about it for months on and off, and eventually they decided that they're going to adopt a little boy. Because Matthew, he's gotten up in years. He's about 60 years old at this point. And his heart troubles him a good deal. And they just want help. Like help running the farm. Because this is why you adopt a child. To help you run your farm. Yeah. Good thinking there, Marilla and Matthew. Good thinking. and she's talking about how how hired help is so hard to find, and she goes on to this pretty racist ramble about the French and the English and the Arabs. The hired help is like all foreigners, and she doesn't want to, take a foreigner into her house. She wants a Canadian-born and raised person to come in and help them. She believes that in adopting a boy that was born in Canada, the risk is slighter. This is wild, the way that she's thinking right now. I'm a bit, I don't know. Anyway, so what they did is they decided to ask their friend, the friend that said that she was adopting a girl. They decided to ask her to, when she goes to the orphanage, to take both a girl for her and a boy for them. Like, they don't want to see the boy before they decide to adopt him for the rest of their lives. And just tell their friends to pick one. They do have some demands. They want him to be smart and about 10 or 11. That's they're not that high maintenance, I guess. They say that 10 or 11 is, old enough to be of some use in house chores and such, and young enough to be trained up proper. So yeah, they're totally viewing this boy as hired help, but in an adoptive way. But she does say that they need to give him a good home and schooling and take care of him. So yeah, and after she tells Mrs. Lynde all of this, Mrs. Lynde is like, I'm just gonna tell you, plain and simple, I think you're doing a stupid thing. This is madness. This is risky too, because, I hear all sorts of stuff. Like, I read in the paper, a few days ago, I read in the paper that a couple from not from town, but from up close, adopted a strange child, and from an orphan asylum, and he set the house on fire, like on purpose. He set it on fire, so he nearly burned them to a crisp in their beds. And another boy Mrs. Lynde heard about, used to suck the eggs, and they couldn't break him off it. So yeah, if you adopt a child, in Mrs. Lynde's opinion, he might set you on fire or suck eggs, which are both equally revolting. So she can't understand for the life of her why Marilla and Matthew would take this kind of risk. But Marilla is like not at all offended or alarmed. She just knits steadily on. And she's like, yeah, I know what you're saying, Rachel. I'm not denying that there is a risk, but ever since we started thinking about it, Matthew's heart was just set on it. And Marilla says that Matthew's mind is so rarely set on anything that when it is, she feels like it's her duty to give in. So she gives in to Matthew, sort of, and this is gonna be important later on, because maybe Marilla is describing this child as hired help, but I think from the beginning, even though they're talking about taking the child to help, Matthew has other plans. Matthew is maybe craving the love and the something to abolish his loneliness, and yeah, I think Matthew has other plans for this child. And Marilla is talking about, it's risky, I know, but Nova Scotia is close. So it's not like we're getting him from England or from the States. He can't be much different from ourselves if he's from Nova Scotia. It's I read this before and I just laughed out loud. This is crazy. Never mind. So Mrs. Lynde is like, yeah, I hope he turns out all right, like with the most painfully doubt in her voice. So she I'm betting she does hope it turns out all right, but she's very doubtful and she thinks this is going to be a total mess. And she's like, don't say I didn't warn you. If he burns down Green Gables or, puts strychnine in the well. Strychnine? The poison. Because Mrs. Lynde is saying, I heard a case in New Brunswick, where an orphan asylum child did that. He poisoned the well and the whole family died in agony. So, but in that instance, it was a girl. And Maria is like, well, we're not getting a girl. As if poisoning wells were a purely feminine accomplishment. Like, yeah. And she's like, I'll never dream of taking a girl. I don't understand why anyone would want a girl. She can't help in sowing turnips. So yeah, Mrs. Lynde, she said all she had to say, and she would have liked to stay over until Matthew came home with this imported orphan, but it would take a few hours. So she instead decides to go around town and spread the gossip because it's a sensation, second to none, and she likes making a sensation. So she takes herself away. And this is somewhat to Marilla's relief, because Marilla feels that the doubts that Mrs. Lynde is sowing are kind of getting to her. So yeah, Mrs. Lynde leaves, and while she leaves, she talks to the rose bushes on her way out, and she's like, "Yeah, I'm sorry for that poor young boy." And like Matthew and Marilla, they don't know anything about children, and they're gonna expect him to be like wiser and steadier than a 30-year-old person, and they haven't the first clue of how to raise a child and what to expect of a child. This is going to be a disaster. And it seems uncanny to her to even have a child at Green Gables. When she thinks, like, I pity him. She really is not on board with this whole adopting a child thing, is she? And after she thinks that she pities that child, the last lines of this chapter are, but if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. So this was the very first chapter of Anne of Green Gables. And you might have noticed that we didn't meet Anne yet. We didn't meet her, and we didn't really meet Matthew either. We just heard about him. But next chapter, we're gonna, if there is to be a next chapter. So tell me if you want there to be. If you want me to go on with this and keep on reading this book. I kind of had a nice time doing it, and I hope you had a nice time listening to it, or at least didn't want to fling yourself off a building listening to it. All I can think about is the amount of and that I said. It's not easy. It's not for the faint of hearts to be an abridger. But it's fun. At least it was fun. Up until I started doing this whole doubting myself thing. So I'm gonna stop now. But tell me if you want me to go on. And for now, have a really nice day / evening / rest of the year. Because it's the Jewish New Year. So, Shana Tova. And have a good one.